Yes, this is Antonio Spurling. I am so delighted that you're taking the time out of your schedule and to participate with us on this second day of our law clinic we're doing online for NLIM as well as CRCC. We are delighted that you've chosen this time to participate with us. We're very excited to have with us today a very distinguished guest, none other than the Assistant Attorney uh, Chuantae Brown. And so Attorney Brown will be joining us in this segment today, both virtually. So we're excited to have her participate. We also want to thank our IT department. Elder Oscar does a wonderful job of making sure all the kinks are worked out. I had a few technical difficulties here in which he was very instrumental in making sure those things went over well. So God bless you and thank you so much. So at this time, we want to start to take questions as they come in. I see a few that are starting to present themselves, but we do want you to make sure that you do not miss this segment. This is very, very important. I see the technology is rebooting and it's giving us some clear visuals. There's attorney Chuantae Brown, very illustrious, hands up, the emojis, all the good things that come from her and her knowledge of what she does over at the DA's office. And so before we get into this segment, I want to kind of make a distinction between the difference between rights and privileges, because rights are holistically different from privileges. Rights, if you think in terms of rights, rights are not necessarily the same as what a privilege is. And what I mean when I say that is, I'll share it with you by definition, and then we'll get into some examples of a situation where someone has had rights may be violated versus their privileges violated. And so, attorney, what are your thoughts about that? What's the difference between rights versus privileges? Would you share with our audience?
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. So I can speak on the rights aspect for sure. So our rights, first and foremost, comes from the United States Constitution. So I'm sure that everyone has heard of the Bill of Rights. When you are born in the United States, when you are born, you have rights, and they come from the United States Constitution. But then also each state has its own constitution as well. So you also have rights on a state level. And so in Alabama, we have our own constitution as well, and we have rights that are afforded to us as being citizens of the state of Alabama. Yes.
Yes, and so privileges, for example, in contrast, rights. You think in terms of rights. A right is by definition it's a noun, is that which is morally correct, just, or honorable. So when we think in terms of legal rights, that's what we're saying. We're saying that we desire to do those things that are morally correct, those things that are morally just, and those things that are honorable. So and that's why in the judicial system we refer to the judge as your honor, because we're saying that their position is the right position, that the plaintiff and the defendant in a case, if it's a criminal case, it would be the state or the defendant being a person as a citizen who has quote unquote violated a state statute or has violated the state law. And so we'll
Right.
get into more details of that. But privileges, when I think in terms of privileges, driving is not necessarily a right, it's a privilege. That's why your license can be revoked. So privileges can be revoked, but rights are not designed to be revoked, I guess, in that sense. Either you have a right or you don't have the right. And so we know the law says you have a right to remain silent. So only you can overthrow your rights by continuing to speak if you're stopped, or if you're in a situation with dealing with a traffic stop, or if a cop stops you. There are many things that have been happening in our world as of late, some of which we may take a quick review of and discuss. And some of you may have questions about some scenario based questions that we can answer for you. So, with that having been said, I think rights versus privileges, there's a stark contrast between those two because, as I said earlier, rights differ from privileges, but privileges can be revoked. Driving is a privilege. Having a right to possess a firearm is a right to possess a firearm based on certain constitutional amendments.
Right.
Even in that, if you are a felon, as we know as of recent, for example, Alabama just recently passed a permitless carry, basically a law. You don't have to have a permit to carry a firearm anymore in the state of Alabama. Neither do you in Georgia. But if you are a felon, then you don't have that right,
Right.
because that right or that privilege would have been uh, withdrawn from you because of being a felon. So those are just some examples. Let's guide this particular segment, which I'm extremely excited to participate. I'm just honored to be with Attorney Chuantae Brown, who's very knowledgeable of the prosecutory system in the state of Alabama, and professional cutoff provision, as we refer to it. And so I see some inquiries coming up about privileges can be revoked. I guess that's a question there. That yes, those privileges can actually be revoked depending on the situation. So if someone has questions to kind of jump in and ask us, we're here for the next 40 plus minutes to answer questions relative to rights as well as privileges, and to give you some understanding as to what your legal rights are given a certain situation and in a certain set of circumstances when you are accosted or stopped by law enforcement. So, with that having been said, feel free to send us your questions.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, no, we're here. And so, Attorney Brown, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yes, so I wanted to touch base and let everyone know what are your rights when you encounter police officers in different situations. For example, when you encounter a police officer when you're driving versus when you're on foot versus when you're at your home. So I wanted to go over those rights so everyone can be informed on what potentially to do or what not to do when you have those encounters with law enforcement. So the first thing I'll touch on, I was informed about a case that happened at a Starbucks involving a family, a black family, and they were end up being awarded $8 million because of the interactions that they had with law enforcement. And the main issue, I Googled it and read over it, but the main issue in that case was whether or not the family had to show police officers their ID when they asked. So I want to specifically talk about the rights here in Alabama. So let's say, for example, you're out and about and you're in your car in a parking lot. Not driving, but like let's say you're parked in a parking lot and police officers come to your window, they ask you questions and they ask for your license. Now, in order for them to demand your license, they have to have what is called reasonable suspicion that you have or that you are about to commit a crime. If they have what is called reasonable suspicion, and police officers have to be able to articulate those facts that cause them to have reasonable suspicion. So they can't just say, "Oh, I have reasonable suspicion that you're about to go rob this store." Well, they have to be able to articulate facts to say, "Well, I saw you driving around and continually looking in the window. I saw you, casing out the store." They have to be able to state facts that gave them that reasonable suspicion to now come to your car and ask for your identification. Now, I cannot give you legal advice on what to do. So let me say that I can just inform you of your rights. So even if it's a case where, let's say, a police officer he stops at your car and he does not have reasonable suspicion, but he still asks for your ID. Legally, you're right, you do not have to give your ID, but I cannot give that advisement to say don't show your ID or give your ID. I cannot legally advise you of that, but the law is that police officers have to have what is called reasonable suspicion that you have committed or you are about to commit a felony, and therefore then you have to hand over that ID. Now, Mr. Spurling here is a defense attorney, so he's used to probably making these arguments. And I was a defense attorney as well, so let me say that. So when I was a defense attorney, when I had situations where my client, I felt as though the officers had violated my client's rights, then I can potentially make those arguments in court and potentially get the case dismissed if the officer has violated their rights. Mrs. Spurling, what do you have to?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think that, like some, if not most individuals, when they're stopped by law enforcement, the first response I suggest to people is just respect the color of the law. What I mean, I say that is, if you're confronted by someone with a uniformed on, a uniformed policeman, with a badge. I just say respect the person in authority at the scene at the time, because it's a very difficult scenario to overthrow your word versus a duly authorized law enforcement personnel on the side of the road as it relates to what happens. Because at the end of the day, you want to go home just like they want to go home, preferably not in cuffs and not beaten or killed on the side of the road. So, in some instances where you are stopped and the policeman asks you for your driver's license or your identification, I've just had just a standing rule to say just provide it to them. Now, allow me to say this with these very few caveats. You made an excellent point. You don't have to give them your driver's license unless they can articulate to you their reason for suspicion. But where sometimes that scenario goes off the rails is where a person is doing things that are suspicious, and it's not suspicious to them, but it's suspicious to someone in law enforcement. Okay. So to not give them your driver's license after they've articulated to you, these are things that you've done that make me suspicious that you are about to rob this bank or rob this store. I saw you looking through the window. I saw you casing the place. I saw you, hanging out here numerous days consecutively around closing time. And so those things, when they can articulate to you a pattern of what your behavior is, of which you may, as a citizen, don't think your conduct is actually suspicious, then at that point, I think you could run the risk of escalating a situation, whereas it could be de-escalated if you just gave them your driver's license.
Right.
And so that's one little nugget that I did want to mention in there as somewhat of a caveat. The second point, I think, which is a huge one, is that you always have to be mindful of your body language when you're in the presence of law enforcement. Because if your body language becomes skittish, you become evasive, you're not making eye contact, then it makes them more probable to believe that you're being even more suspicious in your conduct. And that conduct will cause them to escalate their aggression and make demands that otherwise they probably would not. And so, in some instances, you have to be mindful that law enforcement, like some people in authority, they get into a power struggle with someone that they want to submit. And when you're not submitting, they will get even more aggressive by way of what your disposition is as it relates to your body language, your conduct, your tone, your conversation. And God forbid there is someone else in the car with you that they think you're trying to impress in how you're handling law enforcement. So I think that would pretty much outline what the basic rights are of an individual when they are stopped. Attorney Brown, what are your thoughts about search and seizure in a car when a person is stopped or pulled over?
So again, so police officers, so let's say, so the first example we just gave is when they stop you, when you're potentially in a parking lot and they come to your car. But let's take it to when you're on the road and you're pulled over. Police officers have to have probable cause to search your vehicle if you do not consent. And again, they have to be able to articulate what gave them that probable cause. As a prosecutor, I can say the main reason that allow officers to get inside your vehicle is the odor of marijuana. That's like one of the top, and I'm sure Mrs. Spurling can agree with me on this. That's one of the top reasons that gives officers probable cause that quick to now search your vehicle if there is an odor of marijuana in your vehicle. Yeah.
Right.
So
And that's a huge word. I'm glad you mentioned that, probable cause. So probable cause exists with the facts and circumstances within an officer's knowledge of which he had reasonable, trustworthy information are sufficient to warn a man or a person to have caution in how they proceed. In other words, when a cop pulls up to a car, you're right. And as soon as they let the window down, they smell the hay come out the window. They smell marijuana, they smell whatever this illicit drug is, or they smell alcohol. You've just put them or triggered them to have probable cause to further inquire as it relates to what is taking place inside of this car. A great question came up here at 1218, and it asked, at what point does law enforcement have the right to ask an individual to get out of the car? What are your thoughts about that, Attorney Brown?
So an officer safety is always at issue. So at any point, if the officer feels like there is a need to get you out of the car for their safety, they can do that. And again, I cannot give you advisement, but and I'm sure Mrs. Spurley can tell you, to the safest thing to do is just go with what the officer is doing. And let me say this. With me being in law enforcement, I know that there is this notion of, particularly in the Black community, of not trusting law enforcement. But I want to say that I know there are bad apples in every profession, whether it's attorneys, doctors, teachers, law enforcement. But as someone that work with law enforcement every single day, I can tell you that it may be a few bad apples, but as a whole, law enforcement, they are really just out here doing their job. So if a law officer is asking you to get out of your vehicle, 9 times out of 10, it's for their safety, to make sure that you may, and piggyback on what Mr. Spurling just said, like, say if you're fidgeting a lot, they may not know what you have in the car, or if there are multiple people, multiple passengers in the car. It's just their way of trying to maintain control over a situation.
Yeah. I can share personal testimony about that. My February 15, 1986 was a day of tragedy for my house and for my family and for my parents. My father was killed by a policeman
Mm.
when I was 14 years old, and they were stopped by a policeman. The policeman alleged that the driver, my father was on the passenger side, it was alleged that the driver jumped out of the car and fled the scene, of which there was no illegal activity taking place, none whatsoever. And it was alleged that the driver shot towards the police car, which there were no bullet holes found in the car, no shell casings, nothing. And so this rookie cop pulls out his revolver. Then that was the most prominent gun used in the law enforcement. He pulled out a revolver and fired into the back window of the car and shot my father and killed him in the back of the head. That happened in Inslee, about 6 blocks from where my law firm is. So I've been trying to exchange beauty for ashes ever since, and not only as a lawyer, but as it relates to understanding what the rights are of an individual. But he never had a chance to step outside of the car, although
Mhm.
they got stopped. And he was not armed or anything of sorts. But that's just how, to your point, and I agree with Attorney Brown, there's not to say every person in law enforcement, the cop, is out to do just heinous type crimes and activities, or to abuse the authority that they've been entrusted with under our state constitution as law enforcement. So I think that, just to dovetail back on some of these questions, body language is important when you're in a stop, not to fidget when you are at a stop with the cop, to articulate clearly. Preferably, there's nothing malodorous coming out of your vehicle, music wise, that is offensive, like you are, have excessive noise or sound, and definitely not a situation where there's an odor that is emanating out of your vehicle that
Mhm.
puts the officers in what we refer to as go mode. What I mean when I say go mode, there's probable cause. They're concerned about their own safety, and so consequently, they're taking the position that they're going to escalate the stop. And in some instances, that's going to result in them either snatching the person out of the car if they're not willing to get out of the car, and it would result in them rambling through the car if they're not willing to give them consent to search the car. And we'll come to that in just a moment. But then, most importantly, now there's a creation of a hostile environment on the side of a road, and that's when things go afield, when those types of situations take place. And so I believe that it's just wisdom, and Attorney Brown touched on it. It's just wisdom to just kind of, in your words, to go with what the officer's asking you to do. Now, another thing I want to shift the direction on, and we'll get some questions on this, is racial profiling, because
Yeah.
racial profiling is a real situation in our country.
Mhm.
Situations where, unfortunately, African Americans have killed other African Americans in law enforcement and, just citizens. My father was actually killed by an African American
Mhm.
in the 80s. That was a black man, which, I've worked through some things with that man and his family now, and his children, have been a blessing to him, but it's another story for another day. He was a gunman. But my point is that it's an amazing situation where you can find the slightest variation in conduct at a routine traffic stop, or at a stop when you think you're not speeding and the cop tells you, or he thinks that you're speeding, and it becomes an issue. So I suggest or encourage anyone who is stopped by law enforcement, to the extent that you're comfortable and feel that it is reasonable, just comply with what the officer is asking you to do.
I see a question where it says, if you are pulled over, do you have the right to record? Yes, you do. You can record your traffic stop. And also I encourage where you can get a dash cam if you in your car as well, just like law enforcement have dash cams, you can get that in your car that record everything while you're driving. So there's no law that says you cannot record your interactions with law enforcement.
Right. That's a very good point. And some of the cops, because they do have on body cams, and Attorney Brown, you can speak to that in some situations where the body cam has made the difference
Oh,
in
absolutely.
someone being prosecuted versus someone being exonerated of some bogus charges.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, most officers, now let me say this, not all law enforcement agencies are required to wear body cameras. So, I don't know if the officer that pulled you over that day actually has on a body camera, but most of the law enforcement officers that we deal with in the cutoff, they do wear body cam. So, typically, if there is an issue, and I'm a prosecutor where I like to see everything, I don't just go with what my law enforcement officer says. So if there is an issue, I most definitely want to see dash cam, body cam, any type of footage there is, so I can get the full picture of what may have happened that day.
Right. And I think that recording a routine stop is very important too. It's probably a good practice that if you're stopped by law enforcement before they get into the car, if you take your cell phone, put it on record, flip the screen around, and sit it up between the A pillar, which is the metal framing of the car that goes down beside the windshield and the driver's door, and just let the camera naturally record the audio or try to get some video of what the officer is actually communicating. Now, I would not suggest that you start fumbling with the phone when he asks you to put your hands on the steering wheel. Okay? But if you can be swift enough, once you're stopped before the cop gets out of the car, go ahead and set your dash cam up or your cell phone up so you can get some visual and audio of that interaction. I think it will subside some unnecessary communication, both from you as well as from the officer that is walking up to the car, and just speak plain King's English to them about what you understand you did or did not do, and place your hands on the wheel because that is very important. They see your hands in plain view at all times.
Right, great point, Attorney Spurling. That's what I would say as well. Anytime that you are interacting with law enforcement during a traffic stop, definitely no quick movements. Keep your hands visible. If they, for example, if they ask you for your license and you have to reach for it, or say, hey, I'm reaching for my license, it's located here, or my registration is located in my glove department, can I compartment, can I get that? So just make sure that you're having that open communication with law enforcement and letting them know what you're about to do, what are you reaching for, where is it located.
Yeah, there's another question that came on the screen here at 12:27, and it asks if there's no law against recording the police once you're stopped. Why are the officers upset and ask you to stop the recording? Have you ever had a communication by an officer, Attorney Brown, where they just tell you, I told them to turn the camera off and they didn't? Have you
I
ever run into that before?
I have in personally. I think it's just different officers. I think it's just, again, and like I said, I think it's just the way the media is now. I think unfortunately there's this disconnect between law enforcement and the community. So I think some law enforcement officers are just maybe agitated about being recorded. That may be a reason why they ask you to cut it off. But again, you have a right to record.
Right. Here's a question that came on the screen. Are you allowed to carry your firearm into a neighboring state? And the answer to that is yes. If that state is reciprocal to our state, which is your place of residency, then you can take your firearm to another state. For example, Alabama, as I mentioned earlier, is a permitless carry state now, which means you don't have to have a permit to carry a firearm in Alabama. And if you go to Georgia, which is a permitless carry state, then Alabama will reciprocate with Georgia, and Georgia will reciprocate with Alabama. But let's say you go through Kentucky, and if Kentucky requires a permit, you get stopped, you're going to be in trouble.
Right. And
You'll be in
that's
trouble.
what I was going to say. So you have to know that, and like when I first started, every state has their own laws. So you have to be aware, if you know you're traveling to a specific state, you need to know the laws of that specific state. Yeah, that's important.
That's right. Another question came up here at 12:30. It says, does law enforcement have to tell you your Miranda rights? Ideally, they would read you your rights.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
we won't go through the entire quotation of it, but it's basically where they say you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can or will be used against you in the court of law. You cannot afford an attorney. An attorney will be appointed for you, et cetera, et cetera. So those are your Miranda rights, and that's called where the officer Mirandizes the
Right. But
person.
yeah, they only have to Mirandize you if you are in custody and you are subject to interrogation.
That's an excellent point.
So yeah, so that's when they are coming to effect. So if a law enforcement officer is saying that you're not detained and you just still continue to sit there and talk, they did not have to read you those Miranda rights because you were not in custody.
Right.
So it has to be a custodial interrogation in order for Miranda to be triggered.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And so, in some instances, when people get nervous, they talk. And so, if the officer is not taking you into custody, it's best that you just not say anything.
Yeah.
Because if he does not take you into custody or does not detain you, then technically you don't have to keep talking and telling anything. And
Right.
so, that's a huge point. And so, these questions are coming in. I'm excited about that. But with respect to the carrying a firearm into a neighboring state, yes, you can take a firearm into a neighboring state if it is reciprocal to the state of your domicile or residency where you live, and it also has a permitless carry requirement as well. I've even known people call and say, "Well, can I take my pistol in Walmart?" No, you cannot take your pistol in Walmart. They have a sign that says no pistols are permitted.
Right.
Do not take your pistol into Walmart. You can't take a pistol into the courthouse either, unless you're law enforcement and you've been granted such access to do that. So some private businesses have prohibitions or restrictions on bringing a firearm into various and sundry places of establishment. So you really should be careful if you do carry a pistol and you're lawfully carrying a pistol, that when you walk into a business establishment, make sure you look for certain signage that may prohibit or require that you not enter that premises with a firearm, because if you do, that could generate a problem or issue as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know after the shooting that happened in the Galleria, I know they put up signs everywhere now saying that guns are prohibited. So yes, you definitely have to abide by whatever that private establishment is saying regarding guns coming into the business.
Right. So just on a procedural basis, Attorney Brown, what are you seeing that is typically justifying cases being dismissed against individuals once they have been stopped or once they have been charged? What are you seeing typically allows a case to, what we refer to as lawyers, become null pros? Okay. What are you seeing?
Are you saying if someone's rights have been violated during a traffic stop, what would cause that case to be dismissed?
Yes. So yeah.
So, for example, let's say, for example, the person is charged with unlawful possession of a controlled substance, and the officer was able to obtain that drug from that person during a traffic stop. But during that traffic stop, they violated their rights. So, for example, I had a case, and this was actually when I was a defense attorney, I was able to get the case dismissed. But I had a case where my client at the time was charged with unlawful possession of a controlled substance, and the officer prolonged the stop longer than the reason and didn't have a reason he can articulate why he prolonged it. And so there's case law. It's another. So we have statutes, and then we have what is called case law that comes from either the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals or the Supreme Court, as far as how long an officer can keep you at that traffic stop. So in that case, he had already gave him the speeding ticket, had already gave him a citation, and he had no reason where he can articulate as to why he continued to keep my client there and continue to ask him questions, and then call a dog, and the dog started sniffing, and then was alerted that my client at the time had drugs on him. So I was able to make the argument that the officer did not articulate reasons why he continued to detain my client, basically, and I was able to get the drugs suppressed, which means the judge said that they could not use those drugs because they were unlawfully the officers unlawfully got him because they violated his rights. So no drugs, no case. So I
Right.
was able to get the case dismissed,
That's
basically.
good. That's good. It's basically saying that they were fruits of an
Of a
illegal
poison.
crop. Yeah,
Mhm.
good. That's good. Here's a great question. So if you're pulled over and a, and the cops arrest you, they don't have to read you your rights. This is a question asking the inquisitive, but yes, they do have to read you your rights if they detain you and if they place you into custody. And that's what I'm understanding you have said. Is that right, attorney?
If not just in custody. So let's say if they just arrest you and take you to jail, they don't have to read rights to you. It's when the interrogation. So it's a custodial interrogation that triggers Miranda rights. So if they simply arrest you, they have to now they have to inform you of why they're arresting you. So they can't just put cuffs on you. And we have cases like that where an officer will say they were resisting arrest. Well, if you did not inform that person that they were under arrest and for what they were under arrest for, then I don't have a sufficient case for resisting arrest. So law enforcement officers do have to say you're under arrest and say what you're under arrest for. But if they're not going to ask you questions, then they don't have to read you your Miranda rights. But once they get you down to the station and they put you in a room and they start trying to ask you questions, then they must read you your Miranda rights.
That's a great point of distinction. I love that answer. That's awesome. Another question came in. Says, does the state of Alabama have an open carry law? If so, please explain what it means.
Yeah, so that's what Attorney Spurling was just talking about. You want to touch on that?
Yes, yes, yes. You can carry a pistol in plain view, and I think that is, on a personal level, that's very menacing to people in your immediate environment to walk around with pistols just hanging off your hip when there's no apparent reason to do that. But that's the right you have in this country, and that's the right you have, particularly in the state of Alabama. And so I think that's a huge part of concern. And so that's why you have to be very mindful of the environments that you're in, because sometimes people carry pistols for a deterrent. Some people carry pistols just as an aid of comfort, sort of like a cell phone. If you leave your cell phone, you feel all discombobulated and out of touch. Some people literally carry pistols like some carry cell phones, and there are different nationalities that gravitate to that, and some because to some to carry a pistol in a plain view, you're asking for trouble, and so you have to be very careful about the dynamic of the communities you're in, what you're doing at the time, who's in the environment, and I think it's just difficult for children to really embrace seeing pistols out all the time in plain view. It becomes very tempting. So I've discouraged that, but I'm personally licensed to carry. I carry, but I don't carry it out in plain view like that. Here's another question I thought was good. It says, when stopped for suspicion of a DUI, if the roadside breathalyzer test is refused, is an arrest the immediate option? And if so, what further testing is done to prove your innocence or guilt? And so I heard attorney say this. She said she can't give you legal advice, so I'll try to tackle this question on this. But a DUI, if you blow a breathalyzer, you're 0.08 or greater, then you're technically considered driving under the influence. Another thing that's becoming more common is what they refer to as a PUI, which is a pedestrian under influence. You see people go to outdoor events and they'll get drunk and they say, well, I'm not doing a DUI, yeah, but you're publicly intoxicated. You can still be arrested for that. But on a roadside breathalyzer, if you refuse a test, then 9 times out of 10, they're going to take the position that you're drunk. The officer is going to take the position that you're probably above 0.08, and you may find yourself actually getting arrested and taken in for custodial interrogation and then Mirandized at that point. So you have to be careful with that situation as far as DUIs and how those are handled. Attorney Brown, what are you seeing in those situations dealing with cases?
Right. Right. So let's say you do refuse the breathalyzer. If the officer can still, again, articulate, is what the officer can articulate. So, for example, if they say, I smell an odor of alcohol, their speech was slurred, their eyes were glossy. So that can be reasons why they have enough probable cause to arrest you for driving under the influence. And I will say, as a prosecutor, if you refuse a breathalyzer, then you can no longer, it's basically certain things won't be offered to you, and I'm sure Attorney Spurling can touch on this when he's representing his client. If you refuse a breathalyzer, certain options that may have been offered to you to settle your case are no longer available because you refused the breathalyzer.
Right, right. And the other thing too, officers are trained ideally to recognize when a person is visibly intoxicated or presenting the aura or an energy as if they are inebriated. And so that becomes somewhat of the evidence of the officer's observation, which is admissible in court because it's not hearsay. He will be testifying of his personal interaction with you at the time of the traffic stop. So I think that's a huge point. Another question came in, says if an officer states that they smell an odor, yet not know without a doubt, uh, do you not have? Excuse me, I'm trying to understand the question here. Do you have consent to an auto search at that time? I guess I'm just trying to rephrase the question so I can communicate it clearly. Uh, Thank you to the particular person who sent this, but I'm taking this to understand that if a cop smells marijuana in the car and you are stopped, do they have a right to search your vehicle? What are your thoughts about that, attorney?
Yes, again, if the officer says that they smell marijuana, that gives them probable cause. And even if they don't find marijuana, they still can say, well, I smelled it. It must be on your clothes, it must be in your hair, wherever the case may be, or you must have smoked it before you got in the vehicle. But if an officer says that they smell an odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle, it gives them probable cause to search it without your consent. They don't need your consent because they now have probable cause because they smell the odor of marijuana.
Right. Uh, Fun fact: I had a situation once. I was trying to get to church, and I was probably a little bit more aggressive on the gas than I should have been. Uh, and a cop had pulled someone over, and I was about to get off of 18 19th Street, exit Investment, and coming from my office, and the officer, who's a state trooper, he left the person who was pulled over, got behind me, and got to me before I got off 18 19th Street. And so he let the window down. He's like, Spurling, you're wide open. I said, I'm just trying to get to church. I don't know what's going on. But I didn't know it was going that fast. But the idea is that, with the move over law, you cannot stay in the adjacent lane once a cop has actually pulled someone over.
Mm-hmm.
And so
That's a great point.
you
Yeah.
have to change lanes if you see law enforcement have someone pulled over, because that will get you in trouble with law enforcement if you continue in the lane that is adjacent to a cop who has already pulled someone over. So that move over law, I thought to just throw that out there too, because that can inflame an officer as well. And some officers, unfortunately, have been killed where people will continue to maintain that lane of travel, and they get out of the car, and here comes a car, and it hits them and kills them. So there's some value to that, but it was just difficult to get over in certain traffic situations, rush hour. These questions are coming in. I'm really enjoying this. I pray everyone is getting some good value and content out of this. Here's a question that came in. It says, is it okay to place a call to a family member if you do not feel comfortable with the officer that's giving you a ticket? Um, Here again, personally, I think that's just a question of wisdom. If you can get a call off before the cop is now standing at your door and asking you to roll the window down, yes, and you may keep the phone on speakerphone while you're talking to the officer. But I do not suggest that you reach or pull a cell phone out of a dark place at a dark night on a dark road, because an officer may think you're pulling a weapon and you can get killed reaching for a cell phone. So I suggest that you just kind of consider the lag time between once you get stopped, you pull over, throw on your hazard lights, cop walks up to the car, asks you to roll down the window or whatever. Then at that point, I think you should totally be committed to submit to his instructions if it does not threaten your life.
The next question is really good. It says, if I'm stopped in an area that I do not feel comfortable stopping legally, can I keep driving until I feel safe? So in that instance, I would say you call 911. So my girlfriend, who is an attorney, she actually did this. It was late at night. She was in the car by herself, and she was getting pulled over. She actually called 911 to inform them, hey, I'm not going to pull over just yet. I'm going to continue to drive until I get to a well-lit area. I'm just letting you know I'm not trying to get away. I'm not, I'm going to pull over. So please, I'm on this road. Please let whoever this officer know that this is what's going on. So if it is a situation like that, I would again, I can't give legal advice, but don't just keep going full speed. You may want to make a call, a 911 call, and say, hey, this is what's going on. Put your hazard lights on, slow down, until you get to a place where you feel comfortable. Especially my women, I get it. You may not want to pull over, especially if it's at night and not a well lit area. So I get it. So you may just want to call. It's okay to call 911, even when it's okay to call 911 when you're being pulled over. It's totally fine to just let them know, hey, this is what's going on.
Well, listen. I'm so excited that you've taken this time out of your schedule to join us today. On behalf of Pastors George and Judith Matthews, and also to my co-host, the illustrious Chuantae Brown, we're so delighted that you've joined us today. And to all of you that have participated virtually with us, listen, tell someone else about tomorrow, because we'll be back the same channel, the same time at 12 noon. So please join us, because tomorrow, Friday, March 24th, is going to be our family law segment. We're going to hit the topics such as domestic relations, child support. Y'all got questions about child support, bankruptcy, divorce, alimony, all that stuff. And then we'll even talk about contingency fees on lawyers taking your cases. What fee is a reasonable fee? And what is the best thing for you to do when you're consulting, even with an attorney like myself? How do you make sure that your rights are being protected in your best interest? With that having been said, listen, I'm your host, Antonio Spurling. Once again, on behalf of Pastors George and Judith Matthews and our entire New Life family and CRCC, we want to thank you for participating, and we hope to see you back on tomorrow at 12. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank y'all.